Welcome to the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone. I am the Mid-High Director here at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Today I am joined by President Emeritus at Phillips Theological Seminary, Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend. Since 1993, Dr. Peluso-Verdend served at Phillips as a program director, the dean, development executive, and president. His next task at Phillips was to develop a center for religion and public life. He is the author of Paying Attention, Focusing Your Congregation on What Matters, and is currently working on a book regarding culture, religion, and moral sensibilities. Gary is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School in 1991. How are you doing today, Gary?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing wonderful. And today we're going to have a very interesting topic, I feel like, ahead of us. And I want to know, we just had the General Conference at the end of February. And after the latest decision at the General Conference, people are talking about a possible split in the United Methodist Church. Would you be able to speak about an instance where the church did split or thought about splitting?
Sure, that's actually pretty easy because we've split a bunch of different times. I like to tell people that Northwestern University, which is the Wildcats today, is their mascot, but up from its founding in the 1850s until the 1920s, they were known as the Fighting Methodists, both because it was a Methodist-related institution and because we were known for fighting. We have split over race. We have split over episcopal, the authority of bishops. We have split over the authority of lay people. We've split over whether or not somebody can attain full perfection all at once by the actions of the Holy Spirit, or whether that's a gradual thing that happens over time. Our most famous split, however, was probably in 1844 over the issue of slavery and episcopal authority.
Recently, you did a lecture series here at Boston Avenue, a 5-part lecture series. And in that series, you mentioned that the U.S. Methodist Church was split over whether slavery was a moral issue or an economic issue. Would you be able to elaborate on this?
Sure. In the general culture at that time, there was developed what some historians have called a two-party system. And in the one party, it eventuated into what in the 20th century we call the social gospel, which is to say that the gospel of Jesus Christ applies not only vertically to my relationship with God, it also applies to the way we treat each other. And so slavery being one of the ways we treat each other was definitely within the realm of what ought to be talked about from the pulpit. There was another group of folks who said, no, the entirety of the gospel of Jesus Christ is comprised of the relationship between us and Christ and us and God. And slavery it's just a social economic sort of issue, and it's beyond the bounds of what Christians ought to talk about from the pulpit. And so that's why I say sometimes that there's been a split between the moral issue of slavery and the economic issue that split churches also at that time.
How long did the split last?
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that split, because I think that has a lot of relevance for the tensions within the United Methodist Church today, and the potential for splitting the church, which I think is fairly high. And I think what we learned on the 19th century is that when a church starts to split, the outcomes become unpredictable. So in the 1840s, by that time, the Methodist Church was definitely a slaveholding church. There were lots and lots of Methodists who owned, I put that in air quotes, owned lots of human beings. And there was a lot of tension in the church over that, just like there was tension in the culture over that. The spectrum included abolitionists who thought that slavery, the institution of slavery, was absolutely wrong in every way, and with William Lloyd Garrison and others in the culture said this this challenges the veracity of the Constitution, it challenges the validity of what we are as the Methodist Church. On the other end of the spectrum were those who were themselves slaveholders, who even used the Bible to justify slaveholding. They might not want to talk about it a lot from the pulpit because it was like, well, things become political if it's something we don't like. We say, well, that's getting political. Well, it's meaning challenging the authority structure. They didn't want that that they were slaveholders challenged. Those were the two ends of the spectrum. In the middle was a group of Methodists who were sort of what considered the moderates of the time, who thought that the Africans in the United States ought to be freed and allowed to go back to Africa because there was a whole lot of white people who did not believe that white and black people could actually live equally in society. In 1843, tensions got really high with the abolitionist side, coming from the New England Annual Conference, and there were a couple of individuals there, Orange Scott and Leroy Sunderland, who said the church really needs to disavow slavery, as we did, in fact, 40 or 50 years before that, and then gradually, as people owned more and more slaves, Methodists owned more and more slaves, the church changed its stance. When it was clear that they were going to lose, they then staged a walkout of conference in 1843 and said they were withdrawing from the Methodist Church because it's a slaveholding church and all of our bishops are aristocrats and exercise too much authority. When they withdrew prior to the 1844 General Conference, that changed the whole makeup of who was at the General Conference. Because think of it this way. You had the left, the right, and the center in 1843. In 1844, the left had left. So what happens to the center? It's not the center anymore. Now, some of them were in the center, but some of them went over towards the left. This setup, you got to understand this. I mean, our General Conferences today last about 10 days. That 1844 General Conference lasted for 6 weeks. And for the first several weeks of it, they were trying to find a solution to the fact that, especially that one of the bishops in the church, James O. Andrew, had inherited slaves. And the conference said that a bishop, our rules said a bishop cannot own slaves, cannot own human beings. And because all of our bishops have to be able to move around to any annual conference, and there were annual conferences in the North who said, he will not be welcome here. Therefore, he can't itinerate. Therefore, he can't exercise his responsibilities as bishop. And the General Conference ruled that this bishop cannot exercise his responsibilities until the, quote, impediment of slavery has been removed. Well, this set up a constitutional challenge. Can the General Conference tell a bishop what to do? And at that point in time, there was no Supreme Court, no judicial council in the Methodist Church. It was just the power of the General Conference and the power of the bishops. And the bishops were saying, you can't tell us what to do. And the General Conference was saying, but bishops aren't superior to the General Conference. General Conference is actually superior in the church. This is what the first 4 weeks were about or so. And then after that, when it became clear they were not going to resolve this, then they went to a plan of separation. And that actually is, we split in 1844 while we were only about 5.5–6% of the population. The politicians of the day said, okay, something awful has just happened, and this presages, this is like foretelling this is going to happen in the nation also. So that's what happened in the 1840s. And that withdrawal of the abolitionist group that year before just really changed the dynamics of the church. And then coming out of that, because there was no amicable separation, let's put it that way, both sides, but especially the North, tried to keep punishing the other side, withholding Cokesbury, what became Cokesbury, withholding profits from them. That case actually wound up going to the Supreme Court of the United States in the South's favor. And there was animosity set up long before anybody shot a gun at each other, starting in 1860, 1861. Long before anybody shot a gun at each other, the Methodist Church helped set up the animosity in the nation.
So before the bishop owned slaves,
right?
It was kind of slavery is wrong. Like no, but they didn't own slaves yet. That kind of is what started it. Was that bishop
that incident was the precipitating incident for the split in that year. John Wesley was 100% on the side of abolition, and in fact supported the main politician in England who advocated for the abolition of slavery there. When Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury were authorized to start the church in America, they started as abolitionists also. However, what happened along the way is that Methodists, more and more Methodists who came into society actually were slaveholders. And if a Methodist preacher came to their plantation wanting to preach to the enslaved people, they were getting the audiences were closed to them for as long as the Methodist Church was taking a vigorously and explicitly anti-slavery stance. And so Asbury started to say, wait a minute, okay, so what's more important? The body? I mean, this is like the opposite of where a lot of people are today. The human body in this life or the eternal soul? If we don't have access to their soul, it doesn't matter whether the body is in chains or free. So for the sake of getting for their soul and their eternal destiny, he started becoming quiet on the issue of slavery in order to have access to preach to them, to preach to the black audiences.
You had mentioned that people around that time had used the Bible to kind of defend slavery.
Right.
And that's something you see throughout history. No matter what the issue is, people find it in the Bible and say, it's okay because it's in the Bible.
Right.
And so it's basically been going on as long as we can remember.
Right.
And that happened with slavery as well.
Right. One of the most dangerous phrases I've ever heard about the Bible is the Bible says. Mm-hmm. Because the Bible doesn't say anything. We interpret it. We always are called to, it's our responsibility to interpret it. Our ethical frameworks and our moral frameworks and our best judgment and our own limitations and blind spots and all, we bring all that to the Bible. And anybody who says otherwise, that's real fake news.
Definitely. Now, I have a question about the parallel between churches. Do you see the parallel between churches saying they are welcoming to LGBTQ families to have access to their spirits? Kind of what you said.
That's
before.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that kind of parallel, but I think that I think that there's something to it, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's yes, we welcome you because we're all. I mean, on that in that mindset, everybody's a sinner. There's no one sin which is worse than any other sin. So all sinners are welcome. Which is different from saying, quite different from saying, in fact, that there's anything positive about a sexual orientation other than heterosexuality. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's still, where the difference there may be between the access to souls versus access to bodies is that. Now we're talking about, at least those of us in the churches and in society who are saying, no, human sexuality is a spectrum. And sin is not in who we are. Sin is in what we do with it. is how we treat each other, is love the basis of this relation, is mutual responsibility and the like, a basis of this relation. So in that way, I would say it's different from where the 19th century is. It's and it's not quite. I mean, it's not quite like either the love the sinner, hate the sin, because what do they mean by sinner, and what's the sin here is in fact be thought of quite differently depending on what church you're sitting in.
Definitely. And same thing as with what church you're sitting in. I've learned over the years being welcoming and welcoming other people means different things to different people or different churches.
Right.
Because when I think of welcoming, I think of affirming and inclusive. There are some churches out there that don't necessarily mean that. So it's even being welcoming just has different meanings depending on where you are.
Absolutely. There's in communications, we always talk about there's intention and there's reception. And we put out welcome, welcome you, but how is that received? And how it's received is at least as important as what I intend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you're welcoming to me, you can be your whole self there. And that's kind of what being welcoming means.
Right.
But it doesn't always mean that,
right.
depending on where you are at the time. Back to the issue of slavery, back in the 1800s, what brought about reconciliation? Was there any is that kind of a loaded question?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, it's a very important question. And it's one that, as somebody who studied this a little bit, it gives me pause about how long it takes for reconciliation to happen, and to really raise the question in regard to slavery, has reconciliation happened yet? Because, so the church splits in 1844 over slavery. In the U.S. culture, we fight a civil war. Over 600,000, maybe 750,000 dead, either from battle or from disease afterwards. Right after the Civil War, the Southern Church gathered together in Palmyra, Missouri, what was left of it, and put out what they call the Palmyra Manifesto as to why they would not rejoin anytime soon with the Northern Church. And there were lots of animosities built up over time. And one of the things that the Southern Church said is that the North had politically prostituted the pulpit by making slavery an issue for the church. So there were efforts at some reunions for the next 50, 60 years. We did a joint hymnal or two, but they could not bring themselves together until 1939. And in 1939, the Southern Church and the Northern Church, and then one of the other splits from 1830, the Methodist Protestant Church, who actually brokered the North and the South getting back together. 1939, we reunite, become the Methodist Church, but at a cost of creating a separate administrative entity called the Central Jurisdiction for the African American members of the church. Because the South still could not see, and a lot in the North couldn't see either, true itineracy. And I know in the United Methodist Church, itineracy means that the bishop appoints and then clergy theoretically can go anywhere. So they could not in 1939 conceive that there could be a black bishop appointing black clergy to white churches. And so in 1939, when the churches voted, when all the delegates voted, we're going to reunite. Actually, the black delegates sat on their hands. They rose to their feet to cheer, except for the African Americans. They knew this was Jim Crow. This was during the era of Jim Crow. So not reconciliation yet, really. And in 1968, when the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church got together and formed the United Methodist Church, one of the changes to be made in that was finally to eliminate the central jurisdiction, which didn't happen until the early 1970s. It was either 72 or 74. The central jurisdiction was finally eliminated. And yet, one when we look at the United Methodist Church today, can we actually say we've achieved reconciliation in regard to race relations? No, we're not exact. I wouldn't say we're as split as the United States is today, but there continue to be lots of splits over even the acknowledging white supremacy, or our understanding of democracy as being a genuinely multicultural, multi-power shared state of things, whether that's in the general culture or in the church itself. So yes, we've had a number of points of reconciliation, but it's been partial rather than full. And I also think one of the key things is time. Why did it take from 1865 till 1939, even for the institutional entities to get back together? You needed that whole generation who witnessed anything of the war to die. Unfortunately, it wasn't like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I just finished a book by Bishop Tutu, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and seeing what they did to try to reconcile there after apartheid. We have had nothing like that within the United Methodist Church or within the United States of America.
So each kind of partial reconciliation is involved with new generations coming up, and there's a little bit more reconciling, and we're not truly reconciled. So we're just continuing trying to get to that path.
We're still the Fighting Methodists.
Yes. Which is a great school mascot, I feel like.
Yeah. There was great loss when they became the Wildcats.
Yes. So we're still working towards true reconciliation. In your lecture series you did with us, you noted that today, culturally, about 59% of United Methodists lie in the parts of the country that were slave-holding states. Does this translate to a modern parallel of having a more conservative perspective on social issues such as LGBTQ rights?
There are definite parallels to the old Mason-Dixon line and to the parts of the country which remain more traditional or conservative regarding LGBTQ rights. And I think one of the survey groups I follow on this, there's the Public Religion Research Institute, and Robert Jones, headed by Robert Jones, who wrote a fabulous book called The End of White Christian America, which just just takes the demographics and kind of lines it out and said this is what's coming to an end. And a lot of what we're seeing in the country is really seen as high anxiety from particular subsets of white people, both in rural areas as well as in many southern areas, where really concerned about what it means to no longer be, as the 2040s come on, to no longer be in the numerical majority in the United States when we become a no majority country. So yes, I think there are definitely parallels. And when Bishop Schnase was here at Boston Avenue doing the Barton Clinton Gordy series, one of the things he said that also gave me some pause and some caution, and it's kind of a good way, is all of the churches that he knows of in places like Texas who have said, no, I'm not in favor of what the special call General Conference did. We ought to be moving on as a church. We ought to be more embracing as a church. We ought to include the full spectrum of human sexuality as normal for the church, and from different reasons. I mean, sometimes for libertarian reasons, and sometimes because, well, I have people in my family who are gay, and I've come to see, well, I was wrong in what my stance was, and all. So I actually think, one of the things that gives me hope even in moving forward is that the U.S. church is in fact a whole lot more ready to move than what the United Methodist Church globally is able to do at this point.
This might be a bit of a loaded question.
All right.
But
Like you haven't asked any of those?
yes,
before?
exactly. But from a historical lens,
Yeah.
what do you think might be in store for the future of the United Methodist Church?
I can't see us being able to move forward together. And that's really different even from where I was 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that to do left, right, center, I think that both on the left and the right, folks are really ready to move. I know I have a lot of friends, and I'm listening to listening in on the blogs and the various conversations that have happened since General Conference, from folks on the left saying even the one church plan does, which for the listeners, which allows for some diversity across the church regarding the ordination of homosexuals. And what homosexuality means in the church. Even the one church plan doesn't go far enough because it still allows for people in the church who deny the full humanity of homosexual persons. And on the right, they've said this is a matter of biblical faithfulness. This is a way of interpreting the Bible that is being challenged here. As well as authority and other things in the church, and if any variation on the traditional stance is allowed, this is now an apostate church, a heretical church, and we need to remove ourselves from it or kick them out one way or the other. And then there is that large centrist group, and I think if United Methodists have been nothing, if United Methodists have been anything at all, we are a centrist church. Mm-hmm. We really gravitate towards the center in things. And so there will be, I think, a lot of folks who have been activated since General Conference who have said, we need to find a way to hang together here. But I think overall, we're going to see at least one split and maybe two. And maybe several after that. I don't think the splits, I'm hoping, will not be as grand and as devastating as in 1844, especially because all the trend lines are, in 20 or 30 years, these issues will not be the issues we're dealing with.
Yes.
Because generations will have passed, and for younger generations, this is not an issue for anything other than full inclusion in the church.
Yes.
So I'd really rather be able, I'd rather be able to hang together for as long as possible. At least on the U.S. side of the church. I don't see how the U.S. church and the what had previously been known as the Central Conferences, how we're going to be able to move forward together with such different cultures and cultural backgrounds right now. Here in the U.S., where we now have marriage equality, whereas some of the African delegates are from nations where in many nations it's illegal. And in some nations, it's punishable by death to be homosexual.
So one split you're thinking that might happen is between the U.S. and the other conferences?
Yes. And I think, and where the conservative or traditionalist element of the United Methodist Church goes, I'm not sure in that. They've been allies in supporting the traditional church plan. I don't know how that will play out if the whole church isn't continuing together. That's one of those unpredictabilities once we start to split things.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see after Judicial Council, which is at the end of this month.
Right.
Just a few weeks. And we'll see where the church goes from there.
Yeah.
But this has been very interesting. Thank you, Gary. And we'll see if we can get you on again sometime.
Thanks for having me. This
has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast with Philip Boone and Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend. We're at Boston Avenue, 1301 South Boston in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you. Bye.